Hello, everyone, and welcome to the MedTech Ventures podcast, where investment meets innovation in the world of medical technology. I am delighted to be joined today by Dr. Louise Allen, who is consultant ophthalmologist at Cambridge University Hospitals, professor, serial clinical innovator and entrepreneur, and a very, very impressive person who's wearing lots of hats and doing lots of interesting stuff at the minute in the world of medical technology. Louise, thank you for joining us. How are you doing today?
Thanks, Greg. Thanks for inviting me on. I should just say, you've uprated me. I'm not professor. I'm an associate professor, affiliated associate professor. But hey, I'll take it.
I'm so sorry. Well, there you go. It's one of the many, many titles that we've got. Louise, we went for a little bit about your background there. Very, very interesting and broad experience and expertise. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey to this date.
Yeah, well, you say it's broad experience. I mean, I'm very niche as a paediatric ophthalmologist. There aren't very many of us around. And it's a great specialty, actually. You know, I've been a consultant for sort of 30 years, and I started off as 100% clinical. And the great thing about paediatric ophthalmology is that you see these kids as babies, little premature babies, and then you see them sort of 16 years down the line. They grow up under your care. You get to see the parents and build up a really nice relationship. So, I mean, it's a great profession to be in, although it has got a reputation of being very niche, which is fine. But niche is good in some ways because you are an expert quite early on, and also although it's a niche specialty, these things can affect kids for the rest of their life. So it's all about early detection, and I think that's sort of where all my innovation is around as well. So 100% clinician up until about 10 years ago, and then I started to feel, there were some kids under my care who had been missed. They were visually impaired, and if I'd seen them and operated earlier, they would have done well, and that's very disheartening. So it was really that sort of has driven me to try and develop things for kids in my very niche specialty.
It's good to know. I think what I'm really interested about in today's conversation is paediatric care as a starter. It's been an underfunded avenue for many, many years, and a lot of companies tend to shy away from it. They don't see it as particularly profitable. So I think it is an area that needs innovation coming from the specialists like yourself and the niche specialists like yourself as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah, really, really interesting, and I'd like to dig into that a little bit more as this conversation progresses. So, you've talked a little bit about the clinical side of your experience, Louise. What first started your business journey outside of that clinical operation?
Well, the clinical need drove the innovation, I suppose. And I suppose that's our advantage as clinicians. We see what the need is. And we also know what the workflows are. So you can actually innovate within that space of knowing a little bit more about how it might be applied later on. So it was that really. So I suppose I started off thinking about all the babies with retinopathy prematurity. Babies born prematurely, they are at risk of retinal detachment. And we are the treating centre in Cambridge for the whole of the eastern region. And these babies used to have to get transported by ambulance all the time to get treated by us, sometimes unnecessarily, because we'll say, actually, the baby doesn't need treatment yet. And so the first start was with a sort of telemedicine system for that. Which wasn't really an innovation on my part. I suppose it was an innovative workflow, but it wasn't actually a device. Subsequently, there was my great failure, Craig. You have to learn from failures. So my great failure was a way to test visual fields in non-verbal kids and adults. And that was actually going to be a big physical device, and we sort of patented it, and we got through the licensing stage. But unfortunately, the people who bought the license went bust almost immediately. So it was a great idea, and it worked really well. I'd validated it, papers, etc. But actually, I hadn't probably thought about how that was going to be applied and whether it was going to be a marketable venture, because I was very naive about business. So I've learned a little bit. You learn from your mistakes, don't you?
Sure.
So the next sort of thing I've developed was DigiVis, which is we've subsequently commercialized, which is a way of testing vision accurately at home using a couple of digital devices. And of course, I guess that's the other great thing as a clinician, because you get to test it out in your patient population quite easily, which I think is very difficult for people coming from the other way as tech people trying to apply it to patients, you don't have that patient group tested on. So you can iteratively improve it as you test it on patients. So that's sort of what I did. And so DigiVis is one of the bigger innovations and actually is now commercially available. And then there are other ones like my baby screening camera for detecting congenital cataracts, things like that. So a lot of my work is around screening, because actually, although it is a niche subject, there's a universal screening in all of these things. Every baby gets screened for cataracts. All kids should be tested at school to test that the vision's okay, so that we can treat them for lazy eye and that sort of stuff. So early detection is where my innovations are focused.
Yeah, and you raised a really interesting point about, we've had people on this podcast talk about they founded their business based on unmet clinical needs, and those are individuals who have been personally impacted or in their day-to-day have seen challenges arise. And I think yours in particular, Louise, dealing with newborn babies, like you said, and watching that journey develop is an opportunity to develop something new and create something. But the bit that I found particularly interesting was looking at innovation that you put out there, you started developing, and then you had the patient population to validate that against, and are you developing this technology with an end user in mind, and is that end user able to give direct feedback upon using it? So talk to us a little bit about the patients then that you're engaging with and trialing's too formal word, but exposing to this technology, and how did you evolve and develop beyond that feedback?
So I'm very lucky in Cambridge to have fantastic medical students who are free labour. So you can basically, and there's also that in-house exemption that you can use for trials, which is very handy. And so you can basically do a lot of things as sort of service improvement evaluations with the medical students doing most of the work for you. So they basically trial something out in the clinic parallel to clinical care, so you're not actually affecting clinical care, you're just doing something a bit extra, and then you can sort of get the feedback from the patients, and then sort of change the app, and that's what we've done all the way through. So in fact, DigiVis started off as a native app, but the feedback was that patients didn't want to have to download things on their phones and things like that. So we then sort of moved it into a web app, which actually gives it much more scope, I suppose, to be used for things like home monitoring and screening the community, and how to worry about updates and all that sort of stuff. So so it's been good, and a lot of those things, I have to say, were done free. Without any funding, although I was very lucky that Adam Brooks Charitable Trust, they put a lot of seed funding into sort of my innovations as things have gone along, and it was only fairly recently, after you've proved the concept in our little tiny service evaluations and improvements and studies, that you end up getting the bigger bucks from the NIHR sort of product development awards and challenge awards, Eye for Eye, things like that, and you can start going for those larger grants, and that's really what's allowed me to go 50-50 clinical research. So that's sort of helped my project along to the much bigger trials, much bigger formal trials.
It's an interesting point around the grant funding companies like NIHR, who are looking to deploy investment into interesting, exciting, game-changing technologies, but they're not willing to get involved super early. And I get that. You've got to be able to vet businesses, you've got to be able to pick options that are going to make a difference, and you're going to have a lot of people that have a lot of ideas but don't have a huge amount of follow through. But there's got to be an opportunity for those guys to get involved a little bit sooner and a little bit earlier to help those clinical entrepreneurs like yourself bring about game-changing technology without you having to work 80 hours, 800 hours a week and break your own personal bank.
How did you know that?
You work for the NHS, Louise. I would be shocked if you weren't working that number of hours.
Well, you do get rather used to it, yeah.
So, I would like to see some of these grant providers getting involved a little bit earlier, and I know that some of the guys are, and it's I shouldn't tar everyone with the same brush, but it'd be nice to unlock funding sooner so you can make a proper go of businesses. I
think the seed funding was pretty vital, actually. And I think I probably had an advantage over many clinicians because of the Cambridge name.
Sure.
Whereas I think if you're starting out and you're in a district general hospital and you haven't got a big research name, I think it'd be very difficult to get those funds. So I think I started out in a lucky situation being in Cambridge, and also being surrounded by such fantastic tech companies, Craig.
Well, that's amazing news. So you've talked about a couple of different technologies, Louise. Here, what are you working on right now? What's the sort of next big thing in your world?
Oh, I've got too many things going on at the same time. It's very difficult. So I've still got my clinical work, which is continuing to be very important. DigiVis, DVA, that's our web app, and actually I'm in that excruciating stage at the moment of implementation. So actually I've learned quite a lot about implementation science. I've got an NIHR project on implementation science I'm running with DigiVis to try and spread it. And I'm sure any people out there who have gone through the pain of trying to spread innovation across NHS trusts realise that there are lots of barriers and challenges. You'd think in a big organisation like the NHS, there would be some universality in their approach to some tech, but they don't. It's very fragmented, and having to approach every single IT, IG, procurement is a challenge, isn't it? Anyway, so that's what my implementation science project is about, looking at the barriers. And I have to say, the biggest barrier to uptake in the NHS is the staff. Which is terribly sad, but all those organisational things you can break through in the end, but actually if the staff don't want it and aren't incentivised in any way to use the tech, especially digital tech, they won't. And actually that is probably where the most resistance is. And you've got clinical champions and things like that who can drive it, but at the end of the day, it's people at the coalface who really need to know that this is something that they are willing to put themselves out and change their workflow for. And that is the biggest barrier that I've found.
That's really interesting. We had Jorge Zapata on the podcast a couple of months ago talking about Aware AI, and the whole vision of Aware AI was to help nurses and caregivers provide more immediate care to those that needed it. And we talked about clinical adoption, and in the US, people loved it. And he brought it to the UK and he brought it to the NHS, and people were very, very wary and didn't necessarily want to change the way that they were operating. So maybe it's a UK versus US health system thing, that level of incentivization. It's interesting that you have faced that barrier potentially with some of the staff using your products and solutions as well.
Yes, I mean, AI is going to be a very difficult one to get into the NHS for diagnostic and therapeutic purposes, at least. I think when it comes to scheduling and those sort of helpful administrative tasks, I think there's a role. But I think moving it into diagnostics and things is going to be so challenging.
I agree. And I was speaking with a company a couple of weeks ago looking at producing a software as a medical device digital biomarker solution. And they were talking about regulating it and what that pathway looks like. And I said, well, have you engaged the BSI? And they said, yeah, we have. We've spoke to the BSI. And I said, well, what are they recommending right now? And they turned around and said to me, well, the BSI have said, you tell us how you would like to certify this device. And I said, but you're the BSI. You're responsible for telling us, what this device should be certified as. So there's going to be a lot of change coming in the world of AI, particularly when it comes to software as a medical device and getting these products regulated and in the hands of end users. So very, very interesting times.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you talked about your challenges earlier, Louise. I saw you speak a couple of weeks back at an event in Cambridge, and you had some amazing anecdotes, and there were a number of challenges there. Given our audience of entrepreneurs, people very early on their journey, what can you share amongst your journey and additional challenges that you've faced, and maybe some tips for those that are embarking on a journey now?
I guess get good advice early. I didn't really have any advice for the majority of my little innovation journey when it comes to IP regulation. I think you have to think of these things quite early on. I'd say that don't be put off if your idea isn't immediately patentable. There's a tendency, especially for some of the tech transfer offices and things, to be really interested in there's going to be a lot of money in a license for this if we patent it. No, I think a patentable idea might come later, but actually I think probably the most important thing is, can you see how it would fit in the clinical need, addressing a clinical need, and is it going to be practical to work it into the workflow? I think those are the things that are more likely to give you a successful route commercially. But I think even then, I think you have to think about how can I make this more easy to reduce the regulatory requirements for it, because I know we talked, Craig, earlier about how sometimes people think, oh, that's class 2 device, class 2. Yeah, do you know what that means? Do you know actually what that means in the future if you make a class 2 device? What sort of barriers are going to be? Can you try and reduce that regulatory requirement to absolutely lowest level possible? Can you, I mean, as a startup, there's a real issue with money coming in, especially in the NHS, if you're actually reliant on that market. Is there anything you can do to make some quick wins early on in different marketplaces? Like, for example, for DigiVis, I mean, can we create the kiosk outside and make it something that you can drive people to test their vision, make sure it's okay for driving? There's a lot of that at the moment, in the press about older drivers who haven't had their vision tested for God knows how long, and out on the roads. So are there other quick ways you can keep your company going? We haven't gone really the big investment route for my innovations, and I think that comes with other pressures. I don't know a huge amount about working with VCs, but I can imagine that sometimes that may not be the direction of travel you particularly want to go as a clinician. I don't know, you can probably tell me more about that.
I always advise people to seek investment when they don't need it, which is a weird message to put out there, but what I mean by that is when you reach a point where you are somewhat self-sufficient with a good idea and you reach a level where you say, I could go out and raise some dilutive funding and that will accelerate my journey 10x, then that's probably a good time to go get it. When you've reached a point where you're doing okay, but you could shoot for the moon, that's probably a good opportunity to go find that investment. And I've spoke at length previously about investors need to be so much more than money. They need to grant access to expertise, a network, or support in areas such as your regulatory journey and give advice on that. So you need to partner up with the right VC as well. You need to find somebody that knows your business area and has a very, very solid exit strategy as well through partnerships, through other investments or other avenues as well. So dilutive funding can be great, but you should only seek it when there's an opportunity to shoot for the moon instead of just to keep surviving. And that's uncomfortable.
I guess, I mean, a lot of the innovations that I've done are web apps, and they're quite scalable and, don't take a huge amount of money. But, the physical device, the camera that I'm creating for the congenital cataract screening, that is obviously going to take much bigger bucks. And so I will have to venture forth, I think, into the world of commerce to get some funding for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And hardware, I managed a medical device fund for a number of years, and hardware was always a very, very challenging proposition because of the cost to actually produce prototypes, for the cost to get into a small-scale trial, and then the cost for regulation and certification, like you said previously. And all of this are timelines. You got 5 years, 7 years, 9 years to get a device through certification and bring it to market. Now, there are ways to reduce those timelines. Maybe you don't need to seek certification immediately. Maybe you only seek certification when a commercial opportunity presents itself. And all of a sudden, you need less money and your timelines are reduced. Maybe there's an opportunity to, run a smaller scale trial. Just build one device, get it validated and get it in the hands of end users and get people enjoying it and liking it, and they are going to give good positive feedback for the investors. So there's a number of ways, but I think digital is significantly easier to invest in than hardware.
Absolutely.
Which again isn't what everyone wants to hear. Hardware still has a role to play in society, and it's still very, very important that we are innovating new hardware. You can't do everything via a smartphone and via a web app, but that's certainly the way that the industry is moving, is to a digital first mindset, and we are making do with existing hardware that we don't need to go out and recertify.
Yeah, it's a shame though, because I mean, especially in, coming back to paediatric ophthalmology, a lot of the technology that we use in these babies, you can't use the stuff that you use in adults on babies. You just physically can't. And what the physical devices we use on babies have lagged behind so much in their technology compared to what we have in adult ophthalmology these days. Very tech-driven subspecialty, but for babies, no, we're still dealing with the old ophthalmoscope. It hasn't changed for 100 years. And those things do need to change. They do need investment to change, because just things like being able to send the image for a review, for an expert review, to prevent the baby being traveling across the country to a specialist, that sort of stuff. I mean, it's all going to be really important. And as we talked about the Neocam, which is my congenital cataract screening camera. The fact is, a third of babies' cataracts are missed at the moment with the current tool, that little old ophthalmoscope that we use. A third are missed, and those babies end up being visually impaired for life. And yet, if you have a digital tool that can do that, then, and has maybe an automated alert or something like that, that would make such a big difference, because the people who are doing the screening for these niche conditions are not experts. They're midwives, they're GPs, they're neonatal doctors. They don't have the expertise to actually really be in the situation to be able to detect something they may have never seen in their career before.
Let's talk a little bit then about the neonatal and baby space, because you bring up a very interesting point, which is technology that we have today is sort of tailored towards teens, adults, and we are still way in the past when it comes to treating and condition monitoring in babies. What's your opinion? You don't have to get super controversial on why innovation is so challenging in the paediatric space.
I suppose, it's the balance of risk and benefit. I mean, you can derive a huge amount of benefit in detecting things in babies because it's lifelong. But actually, there's a huge risk of missing things. So I suppose there's that double-edged sword, isn't there, as well? Do you want to take the risk of trying to innovate in that space when actually you might miss something then that will affect the child for life and all the consequences of that? I mean, it requires a different way of thinking about things, I suppose, when you're thinking about babies, because obviously they won't help you with taking the image or anything like that. You have to work around them, and I think to that extent you do need probably a clinician involved to tell you, to help the developer of the technology to say, well, is that actually going to work in babies or not? And I suppose that's a big advantage with my camera. I've worked with babies so much, I know exactly what you can and cannot do with the babies and how difficult it is to do the examination, how difficult it is to get a snapshot picture. And to some extent that the trials you do just give you more and more experience in that, and help you just to build a device that's actually going to work. But I can imagine if you actually haven't had that experience to start with, you wouldn't have the first idea of how you're going to change your technology so that you can use it in babies.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point around, you look at the future of care and you look at where care is going to take place, and is the point of care going to be in the patient's home, or is it going to be outside the clinical setting, which is certainly what the future of adult care is hoping to be. What about babies? Is there an opportunity for, because parents, and I'm not going to pretend to be an expert, I'm not a parent, I don't know, but parents seem pretty skittish when it comes to everything that could be wrong with their child. Is there an opportunity to give those parents the tools they need in the safety of their own home to better diagnose their babies? Or is it, no, they need to be seen by a specialist?
I think probably making the distinction between homes and community care.
Okay.
So I think you will always need probably a clinician to do the test, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a specialist. I mean, we're coming down to screening again, having somebody who can use a device that will pick up the issues. I mean, I'm not actually a paediatrician, I'm an ophthalmologist, so I'm just sort of saying it from my ophthalmology point of view, but you may, if you talk to a neonatologist or a paediatrician, they may have home monitoring things that are suitable for babies, a bit like all the wearables that you can get in adults. But eye examination in babies is quite tricky. But DigiVis, which is again coming back to the web app, is something that allows early detection of disease. And in fact, we've had quite a few kids in Addenbrooke's who've got sort of recurrent optic neuritis who've been home monitoring. We picked up a very early part of the attack where you can treat it with steroids and actually get a much better visual outcome. So we know that works, and I think giving parents the peace of mind that they have the power of checking their child's visual function at home is a big thing, and the parents really appreciate that. But trying to spread that to other units, I mean, I can see the benefit of in Cambridge because I'm the clinical champion driving it all the time, but actually trying to spread that to other units when it could do some good, it's a pretty frustrating process, actually.
Absolutely. So you've got a couple of products that are being used in safe settings, I'm going to say, in non-commercial settings. Talk to us a little bit about the go-to-market strategy and your approach to go-to-market and commercialization, Louise, across your product ranges.
So DigiVis is commercialized now. So that's actually it's a SaaS. So at Addenbrooke's it's being paid for, so we're using it in kiosk mode in the clinics to try to improve the patient flow in clinics. You're not hanging around. Anybody who's been to an eye clinic knows you're there for hours on end, having lots of tests. So it actually moves people on so they can get onto the next sort of visual field test or whatever. And a lot of autistic kids actually, they much prefer using DigiVis than having somebody actually test their vision the normal way.
Okay.
So we're using it in clinic, and it's adopted for that and home monitoring at Addenbrooke's, and we're just trying to spread that to other NHS trusts, but as we discussed, that's incredibly slow, and so we're looking at other avenues, and this would probably be kiosk testing in the community, maybe driven by social media or anything like that, to trying to get people, because a lot of the school screening doesn't happen now with all of the councils going bust. They've actually withdrawn school entry vision screening.
Wow.
And actually, if parents knew that, they may well actually use something in the community that could actually help them screen their child's vision. So we're thinking of a sort of tap to pay sort of kiosk system and trying to drive people to that, just to keep the money ticking over, so that we can continually improve it and then see where we go from there. So that's sort of a commercialization strategy.
Absolutely
maybe
is, yeah.
And then Neocam is some way behind, really, and I think that will need some larger investment to get that moving out. But what I've tried to do that is to turn from a class 2 device, hopefully, into a class 1 device,
Yep.
And try and put it in a form that makes it affordable to low and middle income countries as well, because there's a huge unmet need in low and middle income countries. And yes, there's not a lot of money there, but actually if you can make a device that's going to be bought up by a lot of people, China, India, because the device is particularly good in dark-eyed babies who are very difficult to screen the current way, there's a huge market out there. So I suppose making something affordable per unit, but which is actually very widely distributed, would be my hope for Neocam in the future.
It's a very, very good vision, and I think self-certifying, getting the opportunity to be a class 1 device is fantastic. That eliminates so much cost and so much time, and I think that is a very, very strong commercialization strategy, is getting it to a class 1. It's going to be a lot more attractive to investors in order to unlock that next level of funding to accelerate development, like we talked about earlier. Talk to us a little bit about the funding journey to date then. You talked about the grants that you've been successful in getting. You've talked about the money that's been put in by places like the Cambridge University hospitals. Talk to us a little bit about your investment journey to date.
DigiVis started off with seed funding from ACT, which is a charitable trust associated with Addenbrooke's, and then we got some extra funding from CUHP, which is another university body, and then I got money from the MRC, which is a investment for innovation, I think it's called, grant that's another university one. So there's sort of little bits of money kept on streaming in, and then we basically, as we commercialized it, we bootstrapped it. So we put that money in ourselves to actually create the web app, and then to get it to its current state, to do the regulatory work, because it's Class 1 medical device. And I got myself trained up as a digital risk safety officer, so I could do a lot of the DTAC myself. So yeah, it's taken a bit of money from our side and a lot of time. So that was DigiVis, and and then we got a revised, the implementation study, the implementation science study money from Revise, which is they've actually stopped funding implementation science projects now, unfortunately, but that's happening at the moment. We're trying to implement it in Manchester and NWAFT, which is Peterborough and Hinchingbrook trusts, but it hasn't succeeded, despite our best trials to get an implementation model which they can actually use in those trusts. It hasn't worked at all. So that was interesting. And then with Neocam, I did actually go the private investment route. So initially it started off again with an ACT grant, and then got a private investor in to develop the actual prototype that's been used in the BIGS NIHR study. And I got £1.4 million grant from the NIHR to do this big study. We've recruited 37,000 babies too already, wow. And we should be getting the results in a year or so. And hopefully that will give it the oomph to keep going and hopefully commercialise that. So a lot of NIHR grants. I probably have had about 6 or 7 in total, plus MRC grants.
That's brilliant, though. Yeah. At least the NIHR are putting money into impactful, game-changing avenues, right?
Yeah, but you know what they need to do, Craig?
Go on.
They need to put it in the coal face and make the trusts take it up.
There you go.
They need to incentivise the trusts to actually get the staff to change and embrace it into their workflows. That's where the money is required now.
Yeah,
You're putting a lot down the pipe and a few little drops coming out the end of actually stuff that's reaching patient care. And to put all of that 3 billion per year and get so few technical improvements for patient care is not good.
It's a really interesting point, because development, I'm going to shoot myself in the foot here, but development has got somewhat cheaper. It is cheaper to develop new products than it ever has been before. Implementation is probably more expensive than it's ever been before. But you're right, a lot of the money is all dedicated to development. And by the time you get to implementation and adoption, doesn't seem to be a lot there, does there?
So you know that 95% of proven innovations don't make it to patient care.
Exactly. Do you think that's a UK thing? Is that happening overseas as well? Do you have any data points on that?
That's pretty much across the board, actually. I think that's a sort of international figure. But obviously we feel the pain more here, maybe. I think the NHS is a difficult nut to crack.
Sure.
Which it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be.
No, and I know that there are changes coming to the way that the NHS is managing innovation. I'm not intimately familiar, but there has been talking about centralising adoption and care across all of the trusts. I don't know how that is going to play out. I don't know how that is going to work, but in theory it sounds quite good and sounds quite interesting, where there's a central body that is going to be presented with a technology or idea or workflow, and that central body is going to say, yes, this is impactful enough, this is good enough, let's roll it out, and they're going to empower the trust to do that. But
I mean, that would be fantastic. But even for my research project for Neocam, it's across 30 different trusts, and each trust has delayed the research project by 4 months because it has to go through IT and IG. And this is a piece of equipment that's been approved by the MHRA for use in investigational purposes, and yet it still has to go through those trust bodies. So, if that whole thing can be streamlined to make research and taking on new innovations easier. Yeah,
it's funny. We talk about decentralization is the most important thing for the future of commerce. Give people more empowered decision making, not away from a centralised base. But when it comes to the NHS, it's the opposite. It's like, we need to get centralised decision making in order to get adoption.
I think probably everybody seems scared to sign their name to agree to take something in the trust. I think there's a sort of sense of fear. I don't know why there's that terrible that it seems to be an NHS problem, that somebody above them they're going to get in trouble if they put their name to something.
And I'm particularly frustrated when it comes to people like you, Louise, who have spent years in the NHS and have a deep, grounded understanding of what can be improved, what needs to be done. You've then bootstrapped, innovated, developed your own thing to bring about that positive change, and you're still getting blocked by decision makers and you're still getting low adoption. It's not like you're a venture capitalist or private equity person that's come out of nowhere and said, I want to sell this product and I know nothing about this system.
But I tell you what, Craig, there's a lot of motive suspicion.
Oh, okay.
So because I have got some skin in the game, because I am the founding director, that is an impure motive.
Wow.
And but as a public body, I suppose there is the sense that actually private is wrong, and I think that so if you're just involved in pure research, that's a very lovely thing to aspire to. But actually, if you're innovating and you've got some skin in the game, suddenly it becomes a completely different thing, and everything you say may have conflict, and that's a very sad thing. And there's a lot of we're all type A personalities in the business, and there's a lot of sort of competition actually as well. So you may not find that your colleagues will support what you are doing. I might support it less than if somebody came in from somewhere else who they didn't know and brought the innovation in. So that's a great shame.
That is a fascinating insight, Louise. Thank you for sharing that. And I guess that relates to my final question to wrap this up. What does the future of both the ophthalmic space look like for you, the neonatal space look like for you, and I guess the wider NHS adoption of innovative new technologies look like for you? What are you hopeful about?
Yeah, well, I'll talk about ophthalmology because that's a field I know, but so I would love screening to be the big change for paediatric ophthalmology, both in improving sort of telemedicine, sort of screening of babies for cataract and retinopathy prematurity, these things that are niche, but actually there's a big screening process for it that's accepted that should happen, and it's not very good at the moment. So that's one thing. I think the other thing, there's a lot of talk about gene therapy and all these sort of things for ophthalmology, and we're very lucky to be able to have an organ that's actually accessible with a needle, and you can put the gene therapy straight into the eye, and that's been relatively successful. But the problem is there's been millions of money put into gene therapy, but it's only each gene is so specific for a very small percentage of the population that suffer from retinal dystrophies and genetic eye problems. And I think the optical tech solution has to be it. So if you look at, say, the Envision glasses, where the blind people can put the glasses on, it'll read out what's on the tin, the labels and what's around them, so they get an idea of the world. And also there's another, they haven't been commercialized yet, but there are some glasses coming out of China actually, which use vibration and sound prompts to help blind people navigate.
Wow.
I just think that something sort of one fits all type improvement for blind people to really help them with their navigation. And I think that's got to be the solution, rather than the millions that are put into gene therapy that might only help like 20 people. That's personal.
No, the cell and gene argument has always been health economics driven. Anything is possible via cell and gene therapy. You can eliminate so many diseases, but the cost per patient is astronomical. And it's what is the value in somebody being able to see again? Is it $20 million, $50 million, $100 million? It's a challenging commercial argument to make. Which is a horrible thing to say, because we don't want anyone to go without vision. And yes, we should be funding this, but it's so expensive right now that I would agree with your utopia, which is low cost, impactful technology to improve the lives of people at this stage. Not necessarily, and I use the word cure incorrectly. You don't cure blindness. You support people who are living with blindness. So it's a good vision. It's a good vision. Finally, Louise, wrap us up. What's your one tip to our audience today? You have gone through the entrepreneurial journey a number of times. What's your one piece of advice, if you can condense that?
I think get advice early. I could have saved so much time. So I've been doing these things for about 8 years now, and I would have saved a lot of time and effort. I think if I just got advice early on. The question is, who do you get that advice from? I think you have to get it from somebody who's been through that journey already. And there are programs out there, like there's a clinical entrepreneur program, and I think in NHR I've got a new one called Thrive as well. But sometimes the people on those programs haven't actually done the whole journey themselves. But it's a good place to start. But I think if you can actually contact, I hesitate to say me, but if you can contact somebody who has been through a bit of the journey as a clinician innovator before, I think you can sense check things with them, because you don't want to be starting off on this huge long journey if what you've got, idea you've got is not going to be, you can see it's not going to be implementable in the future. Yeah.
I think that's a great piece of advice, and I would add to that, there's a number of ways that you can collect that feedback. You can go to those events like Louise talked about. I know that the Judge Business School runs entrepreneurial programs where you can come and speak. I know that St John's Innovation Centre run events as well where you can crowdsource good quality feedback, and I know that all of these are Cambridge specific. I know that my old academic institution, the CAS Business School at City London, also are doing these kind of events. So yeah, go seek advice. And I think it's also an opportunity to partner up, find like-minded individuals out there who are happy to come in and put a bit of skin in the game. You're not asking them for money, you're asking them for time, and find somebody to go on that journey together with. As somebody that solo founded 3 companies, I was never happier than when I had co-founders for my 4th venture. So yeah, make sure you do it together.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Louise. Thank you for your time. Thanks everyone for listening in, and we'll see you in 2 weeks for the next episode. Bye bye.